Green Bay Packer yellow. Okay, all right, well, we'll come up with it. We'll come. Did you know there are churches that actually split over things like that?
Yeah.
They actually do split over what color to paint the front of the church, or which side the piano should be on, or which side, but we are going to experiment. We've got some swatches, so if you come in some week and you see a big gray swatch and a big, what other colors do we have? Gray and a lighter gray and a brown. And so if you come in and you see some swatches up there, it's just so we can get some ideas. So instead of painting a swatch, they now have them where you can just peel off the back and stick it to the wall. That is so cool. In fact, I'm no longer going to paint my house. I'm just going to put up those peeling stakes. Done. Yeah, and they're free. Come on, what can be better than that? Well, good morning, everyone. Has everybody had a pretty good year so far? How are we doing with our resolutions? Okay, that answers that question. Okay. I think the best resolution could be made is I am resolved to know nothing but Christ and Christ crucified. I think somebody may have heard a great sermon about that. And so today what we want to do, though, is go to Hebrews chapter 11 and continue looking at these great heroes of the faith. And today we're going to kick it in by starting to talk about Moses. Now I'm going to be talking about Moses for at least the next month. So you're going to get very familiar with Moses. But let's begin reading Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he, and I'm going to say by faith Moses, left Egypt, and not only he, but all of the he's and she's, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he, Moses, and they kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. Let's pray together. Father, now as we start thinking about Moses, and Lord, more than just thinking about Moses, may we think about Jesus. And as we think about Jesus, help us to think about ourselves and our family and our friends. And Father, as it was brought up at Praise Team yesterday, there are so many people that have faith in anything and everything but Christ. Lord, today may we have absolute faith in no other name than Jesus. And help us to find that the name of Jesus is not only the sustaining name for the universe, but it is the name that is above all names. That the name of Jesus, every knee will one day bow, and every tongue will one day confess. But Father, how much greater, how much sweeter, how much more enjoyable it will be if we'll just do it now. And so, Lord, help us to bow as we study in Jesus' name. Amen. Today we want to talk about Moses. Now, how many of us know to the Jewish people the greatest of all men was called Moses? Now, they said Abraham was the father of the nation, but Moses was the lawgiver. So Moses, it says in Numbers chapter 12, verses 6 to 8, it says that he was the most humblest of all men. Very rarely do you see someone with that much power be humble. In fact, they would say this, you can't have that much influence and be a humble person. I believe you can. I don't believe you have to be out in front and being a rah-rah person all the time. I believe that you can surround yourself with a great cloud of witnesses and be a leader amongst leaders and still be the leader of the leaders. He was the great lawgiver. In fact, if we were to take a look, he was the great historian from Genesis through Deuteronomy, all penned by Moses under the inspiration of God, many, many, many years after those things. And so how do we know that we have a dependable Bible? Because God's memory is not subject to fault. He remembers everything as if it just happened right now. And he is the great saint. Again, like I said in Numbers chapter 12, he is called the most humble person that ever lived. He is the great deliverer. A song that I'm going to get Pastor Darrell to sing real soon is a song by the name of My Deliverer. He and I have talked about that. Anybody remember that song? Anybody remember the name of the band that Rich Mullins led? The Ragamuffin Band? And so if you want to hear that song, just Google the Ragamuffin Band and look at the song and listen to the song of My Deliverer. Fabulous song. The only thing we need is a full children's choir. And so we need the kids to get cranking on that one. His name is mentioned 11 times in the book of Hebrews, more than anybody else. And so the people of Israel, even till that day, would still say, we are the children of Abraham, but Moses is the most important person in our lineage. Can you see that? It's a little too high on the slides, it looks like to me. It has been said that the life of Moses is the anatomy of faith that delivers people and sets people free. Now, if you take a look at this first verse, in verse number 23, it says, by faith Moses, it says, when he was a baby, when he was born. And what we're going to find out is that the first thing that happens is he's not a man of faith by accident or coincidence. He's a man of faith because his parents were. And then they pass that faith along. So the first thing of by faith Moses, it should really read, by faith Moses' parents. And that's what we're going to zero in today. Verse 23 is going to talk about when he was born. Verse 24 is going to talk about when he grows up. Verse 27 is when he left Egypt. Verses 28 and beyond is when they kept Pashur, Passover. And then it's going to talk about when they crossed the Sea of Reeds. Now, it's going to be interesting because I believe that language is very important. Sometimes we can get what somebody means just by what they say and the way they say it. So when somebody says that house, I need to think, all right, now what house is that house that they're talking about? Remember when they brought that person and they dug a hole in the house, roof, and they went ahead and lowered the person who was the paralytic, and they put him in front of Jesus because there were so many people they couldn't get him in there? Well, what was that house? It was Peter's house. And if you go to Israel, it's closer to the synagogue than this church is to the fireside room. So if you go to Capernaum in Israel, Peter's house was just 50 yards away from the church. It is just... Is anybody saving yet? I'm saving up for another trip to Israel. Anybody saving? And if you'd really like to go, we need to really start putting some real facts together. And so I would love to go back, and I would like to lead a trip back. It says here, man, my slides are messed up today. And that's why David said he wasn't going to have me slides last week, because of how bad they could be messed up. Look at verse number 23 again. It says, by faith when Moses was born, he was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king. Now, it says king here because at the time that they were writing in the New Testament time, pretty much the pharaohs have ceased to exist. But they still had kings. And so he was using modern-day nomenclature rather than just going back to the Pharaoh concept. They just kept saying the kings. So let's keep first things first by turning to Exodus chapter 2. What's going on in Exodus? In Exodus chapter 2, we're going to read in verse number 1. Now, a man from the house of Levi. So we know that Moses' father and Moses' mother were both in the line of Levi. They were priestly, in the priestly line. It says that the house of Levi took for wife a woman. And we're going to find out that his name was Amram and her name was Jochebed. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But it says they came together, and the woman conceived and bore a son. And it makes it sound like in verse number 2 that this is their first baby, but they've already got 2 older children. Okay, and so it says that the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw it was a fine child. Now let me just ask you, when you took a look at your baby, how many of you look at your baby and say, that's the ugliest thing I've ever seen in my whole life? I've heard a couple of people say that, but most of the time when people look at that baby, they go, oh, it's beautiful. Instead of, man, we had a lizard. There are people that look at their babies and say all kinds of stuff. Well, they took a look at this baby, and this was a fine child. I'm going to talk more about that in just a minute. And when she could hide him no longer. So what's the verse saying is that at this particular time, something is going on that the baby had to be hidden. When she could hide him no longer, she took and made a basket. Now, this word here for basket is a word that in every other place up until now has been translated ark. And so it's the same word as ark in Genesis 6, 7, and 8. But they make it a basket made out of bulrushes and then put all kinds of stuff on there that is toxic. They put all of this tar and pitch. In fact, if we were to do that today, you'd probably get tried for child abuse. And then they took the basket and they put the child in the reeds by the riverbank. Now this word here for reeds literally means the same kinds of reeds that later on when they cross over on dry land, they go over on a thing called the Sea of Reeds. Many people believe that it could mean just from the beginning until the deliverer, he has been learning how to feel at home in the reeds, in the real world. Why are they doing this? Let's go back to Exodus chapter 1. Begin reading in verse number 18, and let's find out exactly why this is going on. It says here in verse number 18, it says, so the king of Egypt called the midwives. Now, wait a second. Why did they call the midwives? Because if we go back even farther than that, it says that there arose a king that did not know Joseph. Take a look back at verse number 8. Now, there arose a king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That means 300 years post-Joseph. By now, Joseph is a thing of the past. They don't even remember that they should remember him. And it says that because of that, they treated them very ruthlessly, because they said if these people continue to multiply like this, they could actually form an army, and if a foreign army comes in, they could join forces with them and overtake us from the inside out. So they said, instead of letting them just be citizens along with us, we are going to make them slaves. And they lived in slavery for approximately between 1 and 200 years. Now, a lot of people say they were in slavery for 400 years. That's just not true. The first couple of 100 years they were there, remember Joseph was the king's number one person, so they lived in luxury for a while, and then their luxury wore off, and then eventually nobody remembered Joseph, and they are now then put into slavery. Verse number 15 says, then the king took a look at the midwives. Now, who are the midwives? These are the women who not only worked in Egypt, but also worked with the Hebrew people, and we believe they were probably Hebrew ladies. It says, then the king said to the midwives, the Hebrew midwives, one of whose name was Shapharah, and that one name means beautiful one, and one of them's name was Puah, and that one means fragrant one, wonderful aroma, not just in the way that they smell, but a sweet, savoring sacrifice like it says in the Bible. So we have a beautiful one and a fragrant one, and they were responsible for going around and making sure that the women had their babies legitimately. In fact, I think Pastor Darrell told me, Ann, didn't your first baby was with a midwife?
That's 3.
Okay, 3. And so a lot of people say, midwife, what's that? Well, we've got people in our very church that, and other people in the world today that still use midwifery, if you will. And so the king said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whose name was Shapharah and one whose name was Puah, it says, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women, see them on the stone. Now, how many of yours say birth stool? What they had back then is they had a big rock, and literally every baby was used by gravity, and as the baby came out onto the rock, it was actually a manger. And so all of these babies would come out, and then they would be laid on a rock that was a feeding trough or a grinding wheel. And that's where they would, right out there in the workplace. So they didn't go to the hospital. Right there in the workplace, they would go ahead. And the mention here is Pharaoh is saying, when they drop the baby on the stone it if it's a boy. So when you see them on the stone. So it's a double. Kill the boys. And the reason for that is to eliminate the possibility of them creating an army. But let's not forget, what were the Hebrew men doing at this time? It says that they were building cities, making great cities. And so literally, tomorrow's workforce is being eliminated today. Because how many of us do something radical today that will end up 10 years from now saying, oh, I wish I would have never done that. But at the moment, we'll do something radical when we should just take a moment, even in the negative thing. So when they're on the stone, it didn't work. It could be rendered this way, that when the women went out there and took a look, they went ahead and let the babies live, because they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. So the king called the midwives and said to them, what have you done? Why are all these baby boys around? We have no idea how much time goes by between verses 16 and 17 and 18, but it had to be enough time for it to be noticeably different that there was a whole bunch of little boys running around. And so it is in this time period that Moses is going to be born, when all the baby boys should have been being killed, and they weren't. And so Pharaoh, they not only let the little boys live, they helped the little boys live. And so these midwives were called in and said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "Well, you just don't understand. These Egyptian women are one way, and these Hebrew women are another way, and they are much stronger than Egyptian women, because faster than we can get there, they're already back to work again." That's a great line on that slide that you can't see up there. Come back to the second service. We'll try to get that fixed. And so Pharaoh sees the boys, and it says these Hebrew women are different than the Egyptian women. And you know what's really incredible out of this verse? This is the first time the word Hebrew is used in the Bible. And so this is the first mention of Hebrew. It is in the female, or feminine, that's the word there. And if you take that word and you study, or just do a study on just that word, Yableh, it literally means Passover. So the first Passover was not when they put blood on the door. The first Passover is when the women passed over death, not worried about their own life, but they passed over death unto life. Later it's going to be they pass over life unto death. And we're going to celebrate Passover in a minute, because Jesus passed over the cross so that our sins could be passed over by grace. This is a great passage of Scripture. Now, the fact of the matter is was this really true? Did the women, were they really that vigorous? Were they really that strong? It says in the Expositor's Bible Commentary that even though the women lied. Now, why would they say that? Because, I think most of us would have to admit that it probably is not true that every woman could have a baby and have the baby and then go right back to work within 5 minutes. Now, maybe, I know some of you ladies are really tough. I know, just a week ago I had my gallbladder taken out. 8 weeks prior to that, I had those other surgeries, and my body is just sore right now. Last week, I did all I could to be here for an hour and went home and got the flu. And I had the flu Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And so I'm just happy to be here. But there are days when I would say, this is nothing compared to giving birth. And I didn't even want to get out of bed. I was, I'm dying. But these women, now whether or not they did, but it says that even though these women lied, or they may have lied, God praised them anyway. Why? Because their reverence for life reflected a reverence for God. They revered life. And so the Bible tells us that we're supposed to honor our mother and our father in the Lord. If your father was to say to you, "All right, I want you to go next door and kill all the neighbors," your reverence for God would say, "No, I can't do that." And so when he said, "I want you to stone the babies," their reverence for God said what? I'm going to have to choose which king to obey. And when we have a choice between obeying the world system and the world's leaders or obeying God, we've got to choose God. Praise God that in our lives that may not ever have to happen. But in their lives it did, so don't be surprised. And God gave them, the word is bayit. And it says, and then God gave them what? It says it gave them families. This word here for families in verse number 21 means much more than they had children. It literally means they had dynasties. Because of the faith of the midwives, Sapphira and Peleah, God gave them longevity, gave them strength. It says, as for me and my house, we're going to honor the Lord. And then the Lord honored them for generations. Wow. Notice though, Pharaoh sees it as true. When they say this, then all of a sudden, instead of looking at him and saying, "You're lying," he says, "Okay then, if that's true," he says, "then I got a plan B." And he takes a look at the rest of Israel and says, "All right, from now on, all of y'all," now you know that's plural for Ewans. So all y'all are now going to go. So anytime you see a baby boy, and the word here for every time you see a son, take a look here at the very end of chapter 1. It says, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile." Now the word Nile is really not there in the Hebrew, but it's the phrase that says the river. Now remember when we say the house, we need to go back and study which house? Which river have they been talking about? What is the river of Egypt? It would be the Nile, and that's why we translated the Nile, because of that phrase. Now, I want you to throw it in there for one of two reasons. Number one, to kill the baby boys, and number two, it was infested with crocodiles. Although it can't be proven, it says when you kill the boys, it will keep the crocodiles from coming up and killing Egyptians. So this way you were feeding the crocodiles, keeping down the Hebrew boy population, and at the same time preventing them from coming ashore and killing the rest of us. It was in Pharaoh's mind a win-win-win. This is just going to be great. Throw them in the Nile. We'll take care of it. We're doing two things at one time. Amram, his name means people, exalted people, and his wife Jochebed, which means God is glorious, and we find this in Exodus chapter 6 under the genealogy of Moses. They come together, and they had other children prior to Moses, even though it sounds like this is their first child. They had Miriam, and they had Aaron, and if we read in Exodus 7:7, Aaron is actually 3 years older than Moses, and Miriam is much older than Moses. She is old enough to actually stand by and watch and capable of taking care of the baby in the bulrushes. Man, these things were revealed. Now, if you take a look at that top line, says Flavius Josephus. Can you tell that? Yeah, okay, so it says Flavius Josephus up there. These things, according to Josephus, it says was revealed to Amram in a vision. Now, I want to point out that even though Josephus is a great historian, when you read Josephus, it is not the totally inspired Word of God, but it is a great resource. And so Flavius Josephus said that there was something special about baby Moses. There was something about him physically, there was something about him spiritually, and then God intervened in a dream with Amram, his father, and revealed to him things were going to happen, so don't be surprised. So that when now I'm going to point out over and over again, up until now, Moses doesn't have a name. It's always the baby, the boy, the baby, the boy, he, him, and his parents up at this time were full of faith. Now, did you know that faith doesn't need to be in a perfect world in order to flourish? In fact, most of the time, faith flourishes during rough times. During rough times. And so they couldn't be any rougher because remember what it said in Hebrews 11:23. For 3 months they're hiding the baby because why? They know that if an Egyptian sees them, they can kill them. It was open season, bounty season on all Hebraic boys. And so they were full of faith, believing what? That even though their child was a fine child, they had been so full of faith that God was going to deliver the deliverer. You see, Jesus delivers us, and everybody else is just delivered to be a deliverer. In other words, you're discipled to be a disciple. We are supposed to receive the message and then deliver the message, and then by the grace of God and by his great election power, to open up their eyes to God's undeniable, irresistible grace. They saw him as a fine child. Now, you guys are doing great. The word here for fine child is this word tavada, and it literally means to speak pleasing of. It means to brag on. That baby's worth bragging on. Now, I've been in someone's house when they've said, "You want to see pictures of when they were a baby?" And my first answer was, "Oh, I don't have that much time." Unless it was the second or third child, then they had maybe 1 or 2 pictures. But that first one, they got about 1,000. And so, and now in today's world, where you don't even have to develop them, how many of us remember the little things that... I've still got canisters of pictures that have never been developed. I'm going to put them in a time capsule. And they won't deliver or develop them then either. Okay, but they'll look at them and they'll go, "Manna." Okay, here we go. John Calvin says this about the baby. He says this, that there was some mark of excellence to come engraved on this boy. Now, he didn't go into any detail, but he said this wasn't just because parents took a look and they said, "This is a good-looking kid." There was something, the Word of God, the vision from God. He says it's contrary to human nature to just say that this was a beautiful child. So there was some sort of mark on the board which gave them faith and gave them promise of something out of the ordinary in the life of Moses. That's a powerful statement by John Calvin, that there was something out of the ordinary. And so they went ahead and they exercised faith. So the first thing about faith, about the faith of Moses, and Pastor Darrell was talking to me this a couple of months ago. It says, here is by faith this person, here by faith this person. And the first element of faith that we see was not even Moses' faith, it was his parents' faith. You know what that says to me? That if you're still rearing children, or if you have grandchildren, or if you have kids that live on your block, and we live in a world where they say, oh no, what could possibly happen? I just feel really bad for these kids in today's world. Let me just tell you, the world has always been rough on kids. But by God's grace, something out of the ordinary could happen if moms and dads, grandmas and grandpas, next door neighbors and child caregivers just saw something out of the ordinary of God's grace in the life of that little child. So they're not just children. They are what? They're tomorrow's church. It says that their faith, this word here for faith is this word tavah. And it says their faith caused them to build a basket. And here's the word tavah, means ark, and it means that they were faithfully arked. Just like when Noah brought all of the animals and put them on. Did he know that there was going to be rain? God told him, but up until then he had never seen a drop of rain. It had never rained. And so they had to believe that by faith there was going to come a flood. By faith, they went ahead and built the ark. By faith, they went ahead and opened up the doors and let the animals in. By faith, they shut the door, and it hadn't even started raining yet. Because everything was believing in the assurance of the substance of things hoped for and yet, as of yet, not seen. And so it says that they had faith, and they made this little ark, and they put him in the Nile. Now remember, it just said they put him in the river, and it is the river, and in the reeds. And we'll talk more about the reeds 3 or 4 weeks from now when we talk about them parting the sea and actually going in. And going in not just on parted water, but dry ground. This is a great story of faith. If we go to chapter 2 and verse number 4 down there, it says, and his sister stood at a distance. This word here for to stand at a distance is this word, yasav, which means to stand your ground. Anybody care at all about any of these pro football games the last couple of days? And, I've had a lot of people say that if my team's not in it, I don't care. Let me just say, my team's been out of it since week 1. And so, I still care about football. But this is what I'm hearing from just about every single person. They'll say, what's the keys to winning? They say, the keys are the line of scrimmage. The key is the line of scrimmage. Whoever wins the line of scrimmage is going to win the game. And that means whoever is in the trenches, whoever is right there. Because let's face it, if all the blockers just laid down, I don't care who's your quarterback, they're getting down. And if all of the linemen just say, on the defensive side, I'm not rushing, even I could complete a pass in the NFL. It may take me all quarter, but I'll complete one. If nobody's rushing me, if everybody on the defense, they say hike and they just stand there. So this phrase means you're not just standing around. You're not just standing there. You're doing something. You're standing your ground. Now it says that Miriam stood her ground, and this word means watching. What do you think she was watching for? Well, the ark was placed where? In the Nile. What was in the Nile? Crocodiles. Also, any other dead body parts. That was not a sanitary environment. And so she was watching, but it also means watching ready. You see, it's one thing to be watching, it's another thing to be watching. Anybody know the difference between the two? It's anticipating that if something happens, I'm stepping right in. I'm going to do something. I'm here. I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to draw attention. I'm not going to make anybody take notice, but I'm on alert. I am on alert and caring. Let's not forget, Moses is just past 3 months old. What do you need to do for a baby in an ark that's 3 months old all day long? You think the baby needs to eat? You think the baby may need to be changed? You think the baby may need to be cuddled? And so they didn't just put him in the basket and put him out there and left him out there for 12 hours. She would probably bring him in periodically, make sure he had something to eat, maybe ran him back to mom in the field. fed, ran back to the ark and put it back in. So don't get the wrong idea. It's not like she was just sitting there doing nothing all day, just waiting until the whistle blows for me to go get the baby out of the basket. She was actively participating. Faith without works, it says in James chapter 2, is what? Dead faith. We need to be faithful, but we also need to be participatory in our faith. It is not just sitting around and saying, okay, God, so what happened? Pharaoh's daughter just happens to come by, right? It says in verse number 5 of chapter 2 of Numbers, now, or of Exodus, now the daughter of Pharaoh just happens to come by. I want to say she is the only one who could come by and make a difference. Nobody else could have done this. Because who would have been able to go back to daddy and say, can I keep him? Anybody ever come home with a puppy? Look what I found. Isn't he cute? It's a fine child. And so she just happens to go by, right? Just happens. As long as we're in this coincidental thing. And so Miriam comes running out. And she says, hey, you want me to go get somebody to feed the baby for you? You want me to go get somebody to care for the baby for you? In other words, she said, I'm going to make the most of the situation. And so she goes and gets who? Her mom. And now her mom is paid by Pharaoh's daughter to take care of her own son. Is this not an incredible story? And so in verse number 10, it says that after all of this, you would have thought that maybe the Pharaoh's daughter, somewhere down the line, we don't know exactly how old Moses is when she gives him back, but it's past weaning. So I want to say anywhere between 7, 8, 9, 10, maybe all the way up to 15. We don't know how old Moses was, but she honored that. And later she went ahead and brought Moses. So when the child grew older, she brought him. Now notice, Moses still doesn't have a name yet. He's still him. And brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses. Now a lot of people believe that she named him Moses because Moses means, I drew him out of the water. That does not mean what Moses means. Moses means my child. This is my child. But she said, I remember him because he's the one I brought out of the water, so now I will name him my child. This is my child. It says way down here, you can't see it. But that's what Moses' name means. It means my child. But why does she remember him? Because this is the baby she remembered she brought out of the water. So Moses doesn't mean out of the water. Moses means mine, my child. Moses grows up in a slave camp. People of Israel were slaves at this particular time. So he grows up in a slave camp. He grew up with faithful parents who made him aware of who God was and who God is. He grew up being taught the fear of God and the joy of serving God, not in spite of your circumstances, not because of your great circumstances, but in spite of your bad circumstances. So he grew up with parental faith in action. Now, this is going to be off the slides, but think about this. What is parental faith in action? You pray. You build your ark. You give what God wants you to give. Yourself, your family, your tithes, your offerings, your talents. You stand guard, and then you wait on God and watch for him. But you've got to be doing all of that. That's faith in action. You start off with prayer. Because why? Everything starts with God. Everything starts with God. And then you build your ark. What does God want you to do? Do your job. Faith without action is dead faith. And then you go ahead and give whatever it is that you said you're going to give. And then you go ahead and stand guard. It says, after putting on all of the armor of God, stand firm. Go ahead and do everything the Bible tells you to do, and then stand firm on it. And then don't get ahead of God. You do everything, and then you wait. Anybody ever see somebody get in a football game and jump off sides? On that hard count? You know, that quarterback will go, hi. And, yeah, see? Somebody just went off sides. I am sorry if anybody just had a heart palpitation. But you wait and you wait and you wait until when? Until God snaps the ball. You just wait on God. That's parental faith. In Hebrews 11:1 it says, faith is. To sow now is faith. And faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the substance of non-substant. And it says in Hebrews chapter 11, verse number 6, without faith it is what? It is impossible to please God, because if you are going to draw near to God, you've got to believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. Not just sit and do nothing, but never get ahead of Him, walking in step with the Spirit all of the time. Now, all of these people, look at this list of people. We have the two midwives, we've got dad, we've got mom, we've got sister, we've got, I didn't put Aaron because Aaron is pretty much still just a toddler, but Miriam was the one that was actively involved, and Pharaoh's daughter. I want you to notice that every single one of these people were used and helped to shape the future of Israel today, in spite of Pharaoh. So when the pharaohs of the world say, and they may not say it just this blatantly, I'm going to wipe God off of the face of our culture, it will never happen. It will never happen. For one, you can't wipe away God, because there's no God like Jehovah. There is no God but Jehovah. And there will always be godly people. God has promised that He will never leave us nor forsake us. And even in the great apostasy to come, there will still be genuine faith. There will always be genuine faith. Romans 1:16 says this, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation. And this word here for ashamed can also mean afraid. And how many of us go to Thanksgiving afraid to bring up religion? Or maybe even embarrassed? You know, wouldn't it be better to offend someone with the truth than to assume them into a Christless eternity? And so we should not be ashamed, we should not be afraid, we should not be embarrassed, but we should never be arrogant about it either. We should be loving and kind and respectful, but we need to be honest about faith. Because what happens to people who leave this life without Jesus Christ? They go to a Christless eternity. I mean, for me sometimes, I can't even think of an hour from now. It's too far for me to think. Oh man, an hour from now, that's too far away. Can you imagine what eternity in hell is going to feel like? The person that created the Salvation Army said this, if I could, I would send all of my volunteers to hell for 24 hours. And they would come back really on fire for the lost. Because sometimes I think we just don't care anymore. We're too busy. We need to go into all the world and disciple future disciple makers. Because why? I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is what? It is the power of salvation. He is the power. So every time you see the nail, and we're about to go into the Lord's Supper, but every time you see the nail, what should we remember? That He paid the price that only He could pay, so that I could get the extravagance that I don't deserve. And so should I ever be ashamed of what He has done for me? In fact, I think so many times when somebody says you did it right, they go, you nailed it. Let me just tell you, Jesus nailed it. And when He nailed it, it should render us unashamed. Now I want you to notice that we need to do this, not just because of the good times that we're in. Catch this. Regardless of what Nile situation your life may be in. And that is an actual picture of a crocodile in the Nile River. They still have them today. So when you take a look and you say, oh, they probably didn't have crocodiles back then. Oh, they still do. They still do. So the question is not what's going on in your life. The question is this. Do you have enough faith to pray to God, build your ark, do what you need to do, put your treasures in heaven where they belong, rather than just on earth. And then stand guard in your faith, watching but waiting for Jesus to nail it down. And if we do that, we will do this not only in remembrance of what He has done, but remembrance that He is coming back again, and it could be soon. If we could have our elders come forward at this time, and let's prepare our hearts to receive the body